Welcome to this AP Environmental Science lecture on the human impacts of wetlands, mangrove forests, and coral reefs. So although we are still in what I'm calling Unit 2, ecosystems, we just got done with the biomes presentations, and you guys should have learned about many of the threats and the current status of all of the biomes on the planet. And those include wetlands, mangroves, and coral reefs. So I thought I would expand on what your classmates discussed with their presentations and address the AP Learning Standards specifically. So these are from way later in the school year. We're looking at topic 8.2, human impacts on ecosystems. We'll talk about the rest of these ones later, but this one learning objective, or sorry, essential knowledge that's circled is about coral reefs. And then there's one specifically, 8.4, for the human impacts on wetlands and mangroves. Vocab is pretty short since we've talked about a lot of the other things in class already and they were in the presentations. And I want to start this out with a quote by Edward O. Wilson, who is a biologist, an ecologist, an ant specialist, and one of the founders of conservation. The audaciously destructive tendencies of our species run deep and are poorly understood. They are so difficult to probe and manage as to suggest an archaic biological origin. That's from his book Biophilia on page 104. But I just want to highlight this one part, destructive. We have very destructive tendencies, and this is what we're going to be discussing today. So we'll talk about each one of these in turns. We're going to start with wetlands and then mangroves and then coral reefs. And we're going to, at least I'm pretty sure that's the order, and then we're going to start with the ecosystem services of each because it's really important to know how we as humans benefit from these ecosystems before we could talk about how we are disrupting them. So the wetlands are super important. They're quickly disappearing around the planet and have been for since the dawn of agriculture. Excuse me, the bell just went off. But what they provide, habitat and biodiversity, they are huge in nutrient regulation, so they are especially important in water purification. You would typically think of a bog or a swamp as very dirty water, but if there is an exit river out of the marshlands or out of the swamps, out of the peat bogs, that water is going to be really pure, at least pure, a lot more pure than it would be without all that vegetation in the swamp itself or the wetland itself. Sorry. I'm going to use these terms a lot: fens, bogs, peat bogs, marshes, swamps, and seasonal wetlands. Essentially, a fen is a grassy wetland that's fed by a river and then has a river going out. A bog is fed by rain, so it doesn't have rivers feeding it. So there's bogs and peat bogs. The two can be used interchangeably, and they form peat, which is we're going to talk about peat quite a bit in this class, but peat is the accumulated organic matter that gets compressed and is the first stage of forming coal. Marshes, typically river fed also, often seasonally. What you're looking at up here is a marsh and you see the rivers running through it. And a marsh is typically grasses, maybe some shrubs, and small trees. Swamps dominated by trees, and then seasonal wetlands are only wetlands during part of the year. In the tropics, that'd be during the rainy season. Okay. We have soil and sediment regulation. You guys have probably read through all of this already. Disturbance and natural hazard regulation. Storm surge mitigation is huge, especially if you're talking about coastal wetlands. Storm surge mitigation is huge. So you have, say, the ocean in this diagram down here. So we're looking at the top picture, the ocean up there, you have a town up there, and as a storm surge goes through here, it's going to be buffered by all this vegetation and by all of the channels and everything in the water. So this town will be protected. You remove this wetland and fill up all of this with soil and turn it all into farmland, and then the storm surge can just go right through that to inundate that farmland and then wipe out that town. Okay. Erosion and runoff mitigation is huge for wetlands. We have cultural values, so they are historic, they are spiritual, they are cultural, they are recreational, aesthetics, recreation, water supply, food production, all of that. Wetlands are huge for all of those things. If we're just thinking about food production, our hunter-gatherer ancestors really valued wetlands, especially because of the fishing and the hunting of birds. Okay, so keep those natural services in mind, how we can benefit from wetlands as we go through the human impacts that we're having on wetlands. One of the biggest ones is alterations to water flow. So disrupting the natural course of the water, the natural volume, the natural rate, etc. Disrupting water availability, which can harm those wetland plants. If they're not getting the amount, the frequency, or the rate of water that they are evolutionarily adapted to, then they're going to suffer. Okay. Drainage of the wetlands, this is very similar, but in terms of drainage, what you were doing is allowing an exit flow for all that water to get out. So you're probably digging ditches and digging artificial canals. And you are often going to add soil on top of those wetlands to rise them up a little bit. So you dig a canal through the wetland, and then you use that soil that you dug out of that canal to raise up the areas around it so that it doesn't the water table is a little bit lower. Okay. Historically, that was used. Both of those are used for converting wetlands to agricultural land, and we see that here in Florida. This area of Florida is a huge agricultural district. You can see all of the, you know, regular lines of the agricultural fields, and they grow everything there. A lot of sugarcane, at least historically, a lot of sugarcane, but also, um, anything else that would grow in a subtropical environment. So you have Lake Okeechobee, and Lake Okeechobee doesn't have an exit river that comes out. Instead, it slowly drains out all through here via many small inlets and into the sawgrass plains where the water table is super high. A lot of this drainage is just underground because the soil here is, or the rock here is limestone, and it's very porous, and all of this water just slowly makes its way down through the sawgrass plains and through the Everglades. Okay. You also have areas right adjacent to it, like Big Cypress, that would also be where the water table would also be very high. So all of that would be mostly moving underground, a lot of it on the surface as well, just feeding all of this the Florida Everglades, which would stretch from Lake Okeechobee down to the coast. We identified this area, or humans identified this area as great agricultural land. They raised the land and they altered the flow of all that water coming out of Lake Okeechobee. You can see how Lake Okeechobee itself has been altered, right? All of this land right here is now dry, that it wasn't before. And you have a very small portion of Everglades remaining in Everglades National Park, and then kind of mix match in this water conservation area, and then heavy agriculture all in this entire area, and extremely heavy development, Miami, right? Um, that has changed the ecology of the Everglades down here in Everglades National Park. Okay. Barriers to animal movement, so dams, habitat fragmentation, changes in water chemistry and quality. All of the agricultural runoff from this area is going somewhere, and it is following the natural course of that water and potentially getting into the Everglades. So pollutants, including pesticides and all of the urban runoff, could be, given Miami's infrastructure, it could be polluting the Everglades as well, the natural areas around it. And then pollution, we won't talk about pollution until second semester, so don't worry about that for right now. And then introduced species, we're going to talk about those in depth in a later PowerPoint, and we'll talk about a few that impact the Everglades themselves. Okay, but this is not just a Florida problem. This is just Florida is just the example that I had. All around the world, everywhere, people have been either draining or raising wetlands, primarily for agriculture and development. For example, the United Kingdom only has, about 10% of its remaining wetlands left. For example, London was a wetland. It is supposed to be on a wetland, but you won't see that anymore in London because they've just altered the land so much. Okay, so the UK only has about 10% of all of its wetlands left. All right, moving right along to mangrove forests. So just to define those, they're a type of coastal wetland that is dominated by trees, the mangrove trees, that can grow from the size of a small shrub up to a relatively large tree. And it's in brackish or salt water. So in this picture, we have, I know that this is not a river, but let's just call this a river. This river is coming down and exiting out into the ocean down here. And these mangroves are growing all along in this area, and all of this is going to be what we call brackish water. It's going to be saltier down here in the ocean, and it's going to be a little bit more fresh up here in the towards the further up the river. However, when the tide rises, that salt water is literally going to move up the river because the elevation is so low, it's right at sea level, and that high tide mark is going to move salt water up the river, and then it's going to drain back down, and then next high tide it's going to move up, and so you have this mixing of salt and fresh water, which creates a brackish water. Okay, so mangroves are really adapted for a variety of salt conditions, all the way from pure or almost pure fresh water, all the way down to their roots directly in the ocean. Okay. Um, they're one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems on Earth and one of the largest carbon sinks. So all of this life, all of these invertebrates that you see on the roots, all of these fish and other vertebrates swimming around these roots, the mangrove forests provide a lot of protection for a lot of these organisms, plus anything that needs to cling onto something solid in order to grow, such as like maybe some bivalves, they will cling right onto these mangrove roots, and there's a lot of surface area for them to hold onto. So there's a lot of biodiversity here. Very, very biodiverse. There's also the biodiversity on the quote unquote land, even though they're mostly going to have their feet in the water. If we just think back to Florida, it could be key deer, Florida panther, all of those organisms. And they are one of the largest carbon sinks, like I said. These mangroves not only have a lot of biomass in their tissues themselves, so all of the woody tissue, but they also trap a lot of carbon in this sediment. So their roots are trapping sediment. They're building up the soil right here at the coast, and that is trapping a lot of the fallen leaves and a lot of the organic debris in that sediment as well. So that soil that's underneath here, even though it will typically look like it's very just, sandy soil, if you dig it up, it's going to be the kind of stinky black muck that you see at a pond bottom, and it's going to be that dark color is going to be indicative of a lot of carbon. So they're very carbon rich soils underneath those mangroves. So some ecosystem services, it's been estimated that mangroves provide about $2.5 trillion annually in ecosystem services. So that is a lot of money that they provide for free. But habitat and biodiversity, nutrient regulating, especially that, being a carbon sink, soil and sediment regulation, so reducing water purification costs, reducing soil erosion, so they hold up the soil, they build the soil right along the coast, so they don't allow it to erode away. In fact, they build it up, so they extend the coastline out, so out into the ocean. Disturbance and natural hazard regulation. So one of the big things is storm surge runoff and protection of severe weather. And we talked about this in class, or at least show a video of this in class. I'll link it in the description as well. But if you have, in fact, I'll just link it in the description. Watch the video in the description. It's about 14 seconds or 25 seconds or something like that, with just a demonstration of how mangrove forests regulate storm surges or tsunamis. And then we always have our cultural services and then our provisional services. So this is the video that I mentioned. Essentially, the top diagram is going to show what you see in the video. You have your mangroves. In the video, they don't have coral reefs, but coral reefs are important in this as well, just to take up some of the force of these waves, just to distribute the energy. And the mangroves really protect the city from getting inundated by the storm surge, whereas if you don't have the mangroves, the waves can just go right through and they can be very devastating. So watch that video. Definitely gives you a better representation of it than I can say in words. So some human impacts on mangroves. This is not an exhaustive list, but deforestation is probably the biggest one, and that is primarily for fuel wood. A lot of that is just being burned as wood itself, either to cook, heat homes, boil water, etc., for washing, whatever. But a lot of that is being converted to charcoal, which is also being used for the same types of fuel, cooking, etc. You can also clear the forest for development, for agriculture, for aquaculture. So, for example, I believe only about 10% of Florida's mangrove forests remain, not including the Florida Keys. Um, just on the Florida mainland, about 10% of their mangroves remain, and most of the mangroves have been lost for coastal development, right? To have resorts, to have Miami, to have Tampa, all of that. Um, Agriculture, again, just like wetlands, you fill in that area with soil and you build up that soil above what naturally was. You could do some agriculture on it, but you just remove the mangroves in order to do that. And aquaculture. The big one here is shrimp farming. So cutting down all the mangroves in order to have regular cages that you farm shrimp in. Okay, that's a really big one all around the planet. Okay, dredging, so this is excavating material from the ocean floor. What you would typically do for this is if you're going to be building a dock, so you can have these deep bottom boats, really large shipping container boats that, or ships that we use for everything now, and um, that can damage the mangroves in a couple of ways. First off, it could damage them directly just by removing the mangroves and then dredging out the sediment that they had built up. Or if you're just doing it um, down the coast from them, but the wave action is moving or the currents are moving the sediment down to the mangroves, it can inundate their roots and prevent oxygen exchange in their roots and kill them off. Pollution, again, see the pollution PowerPoint, overfishing. Most of the stuff that we'll talk about with coral reefs is the same for overfishing here. And then introduced species, again, very similar. About 35% of the world's mangrove forests have been lost since the 1980s due to deforestation, so we've lost about a third of them already. There are many efforts around the planet to bring back these mangrove forests, and we'll read an article in class focusing on Kenya and how they are trying to bring back their mangrove forests along their coasts. And then since 2000, the deforestation of mangroves has contributed an estimated 447 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. Again, this is carbon dioxide that shouldn't or that should be locked in biomass, and carbon dioxide that we can return to biomass if we stop this deforestation. Or sorry, if we reforest the mangroves. My bad. All right, and moving right along to coral reefs, this is where we'll spend the most of our time today. The ecosystem services I just have listed here, but many of them would overlap with mangroves. Even you saw storm surge mitigation. So I don't have that here, but it definitely is one of the ecosystem services, so many of them overlap. The big one here is going to be habitat because they provide habitat for about 25% of all the ocean species, whether during some stage in their life cycle. So some human impacts on coral reefs. The first one that I have is competition from invasive species. So we have the lionfish up here, and the lionfish is native to Southeast Asia or the waters off the coasts of Southeast Asia. And it has been introduced into the waters off the coast of Florida and the Caribbean. And they are extremely poisonous. They have no natural predators in the Caribbean, and they eat just about anything that they can fit into their mouth. So they can explode in population size and just wipe out entire communities of fish just because they have no checks on them and they would eat just about everything. So overharvesting of a predator can also shift the food chain. So that's what I have with the great triton and these two. Watch those videos. It's super interesting. The crown of thorns starfish will eat coral, and if you remove the great triton from that ecosystem, the crown of thorns starfish explodes in population size and munches through all the coral, damaging the reef. For fishing and overfishing, what you're doing is disrupting the nurseries. So again, 25% of all ocean species use the coral reefs at some point during their life cycle. A lot of that is for nurseries. You have all these young fish that are hiding out among the corals, and it's where they hatch from their eggs and where they spend their youth. So you're disrupting those nurseries so those young fish won't reach maturity. If you disrupt their ecosystem and they die, and they won't be able to reproduce to continue that population. Overharvesting of adult fish. If you overharvest adult fish, there's no reproductive or there's no individuals of reproductive age to continue that population, and you should especially not do that during their spawning season. So there's many laws in place around the world saying when you can and when you cannot harvest a specific fish or any other aquatic species. Whether those laws are actually reinforced or not is another matter, but they say when you can so that they shouldn't be done during the spawning season. So you can at least have them breed for that next generation, and then you can fish for them either before or ideally after. Some destructive fishing methods. Most of these are illegal in most places, but a lot of them or some of them at least, are used traditionally. So traditional cultures can still do them, even if it's illegal for the general population, or some of them are completely outlawed. So one that you may not think is super bad is just nets, because nets can get locked in the corals. It could damage the corals. It can scrape over the corals. The one that I have over here is a beach seine. I can never know if I'm pronouncing that right. A seine, a sign. And it's a very small net that you just like wade out into the shallows, and you create kind of a semicircle and bring it back up to the shore, and you collect anything in that net. Typically small fish, and this is a very old, ancient practice that is still being done by many traditional cultures around the planet, and many of those traditional cultures are still permitted to do this, but like I wouldn't be able to if I went to the island, but a local culture could, okay, or the local people could. Traps, so you just have old discarded traps. You have these traps like this wooden box for lobster that would just go down and potentially hit or break or strike the corals that it contacts on the way down. Anchors are extremely disruptive. So whenever you drop down an anchor, whenever it catches onto something and holds something, it is damaging whatever it is holding onto. Now that just may be a rock, but in a coral reef, it's most likely going to be corals. And then lines that can break and abrade corals. So we're talking about fishing lines. There's a technique called muroami. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct, but that's where a large net is set over a coral reef. So you just drop a net onto the coral reef, and then you throw stones onto the reef to startle the fish into the net. Those stones and the net will break the corals. This is mostly outlawed around the planet, but again, is it being enforced? And then bottom trawling. This is really bad. This is destroying deep sea corals and cold water corals. So we typically think of coral reefs as these near shore photosynthetic organisms, but there are deep sea corals and cold water corals that are all around the ocean floor. I mean, not all around the ocean floor, but in many places on the ocean floor, and they're being damaged by bottom trawling. And then harvesting of aquarium fish, which is what this picture is showing. About 95% of saltwater aquarium fish are wild harvested, and a lot of the time, or at least some of the time, they're quote unquote knocked out with sodium cyanide, which is what this gentleman is spraying right here. And they knock out the fish. They pick out the ones that they want for the aquarium trade, and then the unaffected or the undesired fish are just left to die. So they can't, because they're knocked out, they can't essentially breathe and use their gill functions while they're anesthetized. So this is a picture of bottom trawling. I couldn't fit it on the last slide. So what you have is your fishing vessel, and these nets can be huge. So this is just showing one that's like, pretty big compared to this boat, but there are bottom trawlers that can fit like multiple jumbo jets inside of them. Some of them are very, very huge nets. And what they have is these rollers down on the bottom of the net, which aren't really being shown in this diagram. And those rollers are weighted, and they keep the net down on the bottom of the ocean floor, and they literally scrape the ocean floor, and they pick up any fish, any species in their way. And this is an example of a deep sea coral before and after the bottom trawling. And those weighted rollers will just steamroll right over the corals. So this is summarizing some of the stuff and has a little bit of new information about overfishing. You guys can pause this and just read through it. I'm not going to explain the entire diagram to you. And then we get to pollution. runoff, whether that is urban, whether that's agricultural, always will carry pollutants downriver, and that will always end up in the ocean, or at least often end up in the ocean, and then damage the reefs right at, right near the estuaries. Local pollutants can be produced offshore as well. So I think in one of my previous PowerPoints, I had a picture of a wastewater discharge right off into the coral reef, where you see this brown raw sewage just going right onto the reef. That could include solid waste as well, so dumping or disposal of wastewater. Okay, those pollutants, whether they are from runoff or from the local area, include pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers. So pesticides, kill everything. Herbicides can kill things. Fertilizers can lead to algal blooms and eutrophication. Same thing with wastewater and sewage. So not only is it toxic to many organisms, but it can lead to an algal bloom. Industrial waste, typically toxic, often with heavy metals such as copper, and copper has been shown to slow the development of the coral polyps, so the little individual animals in the coral. And then just sediment. So sediment from rivers, sediment from the like a parking lot from urban runoff. Okay. One of the big emerging ones that people are finding is sunscreen. There's about 14,000 tons annually that enters the oceans. So, none of us want to get sunburned. We all slather on some sunscreen. We go right into the water, and some of that stays on our skin. Some of it gets washed off. All right. Some of the chemicals have been leaked to coral bleaching. Others will increase quantities of hydrogen peroxide in the oceans. Palau in 2018 was the first country to ban sunscreens containing 10 chemicals, including oxybenzone. Oxybenzone is an endocrine disruptor. We'll talk about that when we talk about endocrine disruptors. And Hawaii followed suit, banning all sunscreens that contain oxybenzone or octinoxidate. Okay, so there is some progress being made on that front, but because the oceans is a global system, and I don't know how long it takes for these sunscreen chemicals like oxybenzone to break down, who knows if they become globally distributed. Obviously in very small concentrations, but they'd be very high concentrations if you have 10,000 people at a beach resort all going snorkeling around a single coral reef, right? And they all have sunscreen on. Okay, and that brings us right along to coral bleaching. Coral bleaching, it's really important to separate from ocean acidification in your head. Coral bleaching is due to high temperatures and to a lesser extent, pollution. Okay, so some chemicals have been shown to cause coral bleaching. One of those is that oxybenzone from the last slide on sunscreen. But high temperatures are definitely the key one. Okay. Essentially what happens is that the change in temperature, the high temps, stress out the corals. The corals are a symbiotic relationship between the coral polyp, which is the animal portion, the little filter feeding animals that make up the calcium carbonate skeleton, and a symbiotic algae, the zooxanthellae. Okay, so it's right there or down here in this diagram, the zooxanthellae. Probably not pronouncing that correctly either. So high temperatures, the coral itself is going to kick out or expel the algae. So the algae is going to leave the coral like you see in this diagram. All those little blue dots are leaving the coral polyps. That leaves the coral white and bleached. It's the algae that give the coral its color. So without the algae, the coral is just going to appear this clear, dead white color. Okay. So the algae give it the purples and pinks and greens and all of the really cool coral colors, the yellows, all of that. All of those are photosynthetic or, due to photosynthetic pigments. So without those photosynthetic algae, the animal itself will eventually die because it can't just live on the filter feeding. It really needs that symbiotic algae, so they will eventually die. Okay. In this diagram, what's being shown right here is that once they die, they're covered by these what I think of as pond scum algae. It's not the symbiotic algae, it's this nasty filamentous algae that's just using the surface of the coral as a surface to colonize and photosynthesize on. Okay, but it's not good for the coral. In fact, it could smother what bit of animal polyps remain. Okay, so it's really important that you know that high temperatures lead to coral bleaching. So whenever you have a temperature spike on a coral reef, you will often see that associated with a bleaching event. These bleaching events can be highly destructive. They can wipe out entire coral reefs or entire sections of a reef, and it can take many years for that reef to recover because corals are relatively slow growing. And needless to say, as global temperatures rise, the ocean temperature is rising as well, causing more and more coral bleaching due to heat stress. All right, moving on to ocean acidification. Sorry. So the climate change, again, is leading to the bleaching. So high atmospheric temperatures in the atmosphere, obviously atmospheric temperatures in the atmosphere, are leading to high ocean temperatures, so temps, and the ocean, which is leading to bleaching. Okay. Ocean acidification. This is separate from coral bleaching. This is another effect of global climate change and high CO2 levels. Okay, so we've talked about this at length in class, so I'm going to kind of breeze through it, especially when we talked about the carbon cycle, and I'm going to use the diagram on the next slide. So if you want to write this down, pause it right now and write it down. So recall that carbon dioxide always dissolves into and dissolves out of the ocean, the air-sea gas exchange right here. That carbon dioxide and the water will react with the water to form carbonic acid. Note the weight of the arrows. So it's a stronger forward reaction to carbonic acid than reverse reaction back to carbon dioxide and water. That carbonic acid will dissociate into bicarbonate and one of those hydrogen ions. Those hydrogen ions we're going to collect right here, and we have our bicarbonate, right? So our bicarbonate can a little bit, so this bicarbonate's going down there, can a little bit go to this backward reaction and form carbonate ions. I'm saying backward because it's heading to the left. Okay, those carbonate ions are what living things need to build their shells. They cannot use bicarbonate ions. There's calcium ions always floating around in the ocean. And these living organisms, whether that's the coral skeletons, whether it's starfish skeletons, whether it's the shells of mollusks or diatoms or foraminifera, they will use calcium that's always available in the ocean and these carbonate ions to build their shells. They need to put quite a bit of energy into that to have that reaction go forward because that, again, is a smaller arrow than the opposite. All right. But what you have if you have a higher proportion of hydrogen ions is more of this reverse reaction, or this forward reaction, sorry, we're going to the right, this forward reaction to bicarbonate. So you increase the amount of carbonic acid, meaning that you're going to increase the amount of bicarb, increase the amount of hydrogen ions, and the increased amount of hydrogen ions is going to move more towards the bicarbonate than it will the carbonate. Plus, these hydrogen ions that are building up in the ocean have a higher affinity for carbonate than calcium does. They will kick off the calcium and turn that into bicarbonate also. Okay, so increased CO2 is going to increase the carbonic acid, which is going to increase the concentration of hydrogen ions. And recall that the concentration of hydrogen ions is what acidity is. And that's going to cause more bicarb to be formed and less carbonate, plus it will actively dissolve those shells if it becomes high enough concentrations of hydrogen ions. Okay. On the last slide, I didn't mention it, but I showed the parts per million, so you can go back and look at that. Oceans have absorbed between 20 and 30% of all the CO2 that we've emitted into the atmosphere since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and acidity therefore has risen by about 30%. Recall that that pH is a logarithmic scale, so it's a decrease in 0.1 per pH unit, but that's a 30% change. Okay, so it's a huge acidification, even though it doesn't look like it is when you just say going from 8.3 down to 8.1 or 8.2. Okay, it's a 30% change. It's huge. All right, so real quick, AP practice question. Which of the following correctly describes the shift in pH involved in global ocean acidification? Take a second to pause this, think about it. And the answer is a change from slightly basic towards pH neutral. So the ocean has a variable pH. You saw that on the last slide. But pre-industrial levels were between 8.2 and 8.3. It's now about 8.05 to 8.1, some places 8.15, but it can drop as low as 7.7 or 7.8 by the end of the century. Remember that pH of 7 is neutral, so 7.0 would be neutral. We are moving from slightly basic towards pH neutral, but we have not gotten pH neutral yet. We have not gotten to the acidic side yet. So I'll give you a second to look at this slide, but essentially up here in the 8.2s all around the ocean in 1770 to the 8.1 region, 8.05 region down here in 2000, and then projected for 2100 down here in the 7.7 range. Okay, so we're not going to hit a literally acidic ocean, at least within our lifetimes. All right, we've talked about this before, ocean acidification and the effects that it's going to have on living organisms. The main thing that I want to point out is here, corals are going to have a very tough time forming their calcium carbonate skeletons as well as maintaining those calcium carbonate skeletons. But that applies for every group of organisms in the oceans that form those skeletons or exoskeletons or shells or whatever. Okay, finally, some more human impacts on coral reefs, disease, so invasive pathogens just shifting organisms around the world, and those rising temperatures allowing those pathogens to shift out of their normal ranges. Recreation, you can see how flattened this bit of coral is because of thousands of tourists like this guy just standing on them with their flipper feet. We also have, boats hitting them, all of that. That could be recreation, that could be for shipping. Dredging, so literally just excavating all that material from the ocean floor. If you have a city that needs a dock, you got to have these large bottom ships go through, and they need space down there. They can't be scraping against a coral reef, so you remove the coral reef. Coral mining. This is really a problem on some impoverished islands where you you use the coral literally as a construction material or the rock that the coral is on for a construction material. And then just building and development right on the coral reefs, the construction of sea walls for flood mitigation, all of that stuff. So that was just hitting the major human impacts of coral reefs, wetlands, and mangroves. Again, you should have gotten quite a bit of that in the Biomes presentations, but because they're AP learning objectives, I wanted to address them specifically. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in class.